I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Okay, so Kamau Franklin is joining us now, longtime activist, lawyer, organizer, and I wanted to ask you, as we enter and enjoy Black August, I wanted to ask you about, as someone who has practiced law in the context of an African or Black revolutionary freedom struggle, what is your broad philosophical approach to the law as it's applied here in the United States, and how does it relate to this tradition of struggle in Black August?
Well, I think the law as it's applied, particularly to Black people, other people of color, women, poor folks, I think the law is applied to justify and to keep the status quo going. So when I say that, what I mean is that the law is fine with whether it's civil court and or criminal court. It's fine with keeping the balance of power the way it is. The law is not used necessarily to shift the balance of power, and it will never be used adequately to do that. The law may help in smoothing things over, and I think that's about as much as what we can expect a lot of times from the legal apparatus of the United States. So, for instance, there's a history after struggle, and struggle by struggle I mean street protests, petitions, and so forth, organizing in various levels and ways, in which the legal system will cede some of its, I would say, surface dominance to make sure that people will continue to believe in and use the system of the United States law to attempt to get some sort of justice. I think that's the usual standard when there's so much pressure put, or there's a lot of pressure put. Then all of a sudden the law will adjust and say, wait a minute, what we said 6 months ago, 6 years ago, 60 years ago, that we said that was once constitutional, now that's no longer constitutional. This is the new rule. And that new rule will go so far and only there to make sure that it adequately allows people to feel at least that some things and some changes have been made, but not enough, again, to overturn and or change, obviously, the status quo. And what I mean by the status quo is the protection of capital, the protection of, in particular, white males who own most of the capital, and making sure that that stays in their hands. And I think even in civil cases, in criminal cases and civil cases, you have a system of justice on a lower end that's meant to stop people from killing each other on the street. And I think that's a good thing, right? That's not a bad thing. So in civil contests, as opposed to shooting somebody or hitting somebody over the head because they borrowed money and didn't pay it back or so forth, we have those kind of systems. And again, I think those are good systems. But as we get further up the scale, what happens is that the law smacks on the hand rich capital. It doesn't do anything to destabilize it. And as we've seen somewhat recently, it will even change its rules in midstream to benefit and to keep that capital going, i.e. the banks in the 2006, 2006 to 2008, basically recession/depression, where things shifted because it was done so because it was to the benefit of the banks. When it comes to criminal law, in the context, again, of people of color and Black people in the United States, that's meant, in my opinion, to suppress, for the most part, populations, to control them, to make sure that people stay within a confined way of doing things, and to let folks know that you can go so far but no further in terms of trying to change laws, whether or not that's through activist struggle or something more revolutionary. So as I bring this all to Black August and what it means for us as Black August, as we know, Black August was started in the penal system as a way to remember political activists, organizers, revolutionaries, particularly George Jackson, who was assassinated by the state. And what happens in the cases of regular Black folks as well as Black folks who are revolutionaries, the same rules usually apply. The state will not punish those who kill Black people, particularly if they are empowered by the state to do so. Whether or not that's on a mass scale, as we think about Attica, and on individual revolutionaries who've been killed, i.e., again, George Jackson, Fred Hampton, and others. So the suppression that's used by the criminal law system is meant to keep people in their place. Again, it's meant to make sure that people do not use extra legal means to rise up and or legal means to rise up and to challenge the power of the state.
You've also done some work specifically yourself with political prisoners, and obviously you know a lot about the histories of the legal struggles of political prisoners that you weren't directly involved with. I'm wondering if there's anything in your experience, directly or indirectly, that you could share that sort of highlights some of what you've said about how the law works vis-a-vis those engaged in overt, clear political struggle, as opposed to sort of the run-of-the-mill standard abuses that we see every day.
Well, when we look at a case, and let's look at a case where some would consider that the legal system, quote unquote, worked, right? Let's look at the case of either Geronimo Pratt, and or we can look at Rubin Wahad when I worked on his civil case post his release. But when we look at the cases of let's use Rubin Wahad, who was convicted in the 1970s of a killing of a police officer, and evidence, it was later discovered that evidence was withheld from the defense. And once it was discovered that evidence was held, eventually after approximately 19 years, he was released. So people will look at that and say, oh, that's a victory. But was it really a victory, right? Because what happened in that case is the prosecution, and no one from the prosecution side is ever going to jail or prison for withholding any evidence. The man was held for, again, close to 2 decades, past the point in which there was a viable revolutionary struggle, human rights struggle that was going on in the Black community. So what happens is that even in these cases where people think that they've gotten some relief or some justice, it's done in a way in which even when evidence clearly could show that there was prosecution misconduct and or prosecution bias, the court system works it's so long through determining whether or not this evidence should have been given over or should not, that obviously it saves someone's life in terms of them getting out eventually, but it does it in such a way where it makes the organizing and the work that the person was doing at the time obsolete. And so they no longer pose the type of danger that they did in terms of challenging the status quo or challenging the system, because they've had to stay in prison so long. And the attempt obviously is to try to break them, is try to move past a time period in which they are no longer relevant in terms of a larger struggle. So when we look at the actual cases that some people would define as somewhat of a success, because eventually the person was let out, and so the court system has shown itself to be magnanimous and to have worked because, look, evidence was found and then this person was let out, is done in such a slow, methodical way that it doesn't do the job of getting this person out in a timely manner. The person has lost upwards of 18, 19 years of their life. On the prosecution side, the officials were never punished for withholding that evidence. In fact, some of them went on to become judges and still hold judgeships. So in this respect, it shows that even when you think that the system is working in some way and is lauded as something to be celebrated because you're happy that someone gets out, even in those cases when you have a deeper analysis of what's happening, you can see how the system works, again, to keep the status quo going.
Well, Kamau Franklin, thank you very much for joining us and to discuss this a little bit about the law in Black August. And folks need to know that they can follow up with Kamau Franklin online at grassrootsthinking.com, where they will, of course, find his latest piece on called New Rules After Zimmerman Verdict. Kamau Franklin, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.